I want to talk to you about the top 10 lessons that I have learned as a woman in medicine, and I hope that it kind of helps you in your journey, in your career. Many people are shocked to find out that only 30% of practicing physicians in the United States are female. I conducted a poll on Twitter to see how many people actually knew about this. And ironically, the numbers were 70% did not know about it and 30% did know about it. And I wonder if that 30% were actually women in medicine. I'm going to break down global statistics in comparison to the United States. So I'm going to let you know which countries are lower than the United States, which countries are a little bit higher, which countries are 50-50, and which countries have blown it out of the water. So the United States is actually at the bottom of the list. The latest data that I have is pulled from 2015. I'll have this graph up for you in the show notes, but to basically break it down, there are two countries that are below the United States at around 20%, and that's Korea and Japan. Countries in the 40 to 50% range are United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, and all of them have seen significant growth as well in the last 15 years of about 10%, which is what we've also seen in the United States. Countries ranging from 51% to 60% are Portugal, Hungary, Poland, Finland, Slovenia, and Spain. Now, the most interesting statistic that I came across were from Latvia and Estonia. Both of them are at 74% female physicians, and they've been like that since 2000, meaning they have always had this ratio of physicians for 20 years now. Now, some people might look at that country's ratio and decide, hey, that's not appropriate or that's too many women. We need a balance. But I'm reminded of the most amazing quote by the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she said, when I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there had been 9 men and nobody ever raised a question about that. Now, that is such a powerful insight. And I love that she says that because we have had in this country primarily male physicians and no one thought anything of it. So if we completely swing in the other direction, similar to countries like Latvia and Estonia, I don't really see that this would be a big problem. All right, now let's just go ahead and dive into my top 10 lessons. Lesson number 1 is to always ask. Women tend to not ask. This is statistically proven in multiple studies over and over again. I do a really deep dive in my contract negotiation episode about MBAs who had recently graduated from Carnegie Mellon University and what percentage of the women had negotiated their first job offer versus the percentage of men who negotiated their first job offer. But I'm going to talk about another study where the participants were playing some sort of word game and they were told that they were going to get paid between $3 to $10. The researcher then told the participant after completing whatever game it was, here is $3. Is $3 okay? For the men, it was not okay. Requests for money beyond the $3 up to $10 far exceeded the women in a ratio of 9 to 1. That blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. And then I came across another study that was published in 2003, Harvard Business Review. A survey of 291 men and women were asked, when was your most recent negotiation? When was your second most recent negotiation? And when do you expect to negotiate next? The study showed that men place themselves in negotiation situations more often than women do, period. So in regard to the question, when was your most recent negotiation? Men answered 2 weeks ago and women answered 4 weeks ago. When was your second most recent negotiation? Men said 7 weeks ago and women said 24 weeks ago. And when do you expect to negotiate next? The men said in 1 week, and the women said in 4 weeks. So statistically speaking, men asking more frequently means that they are probably more frequently getting raises. And because I knew about this study, at every single quarterly evaluation that I had when I was in academic medicine, I would ask my director for a raise. She said no every single time and gave me a list of the reasons why. In academic medicine, budgets are finite within each department. So whatever. But at least I knew that I was asking and advocating on my behalf, and I wasn't going to apologize about that. And I do a much deeper dive about these numbers, contract negotiations, how to kind of go about that in the episode on contract negotiations. So check that out. Lesson number 2 is to always ask, but not for permission. I think this happens more because it's habit and childhood learned behaviors rather than actually really needing someone to give them the green light. Because children ask for permission, not grown women. And my motto is to not ask for permission, but to ask for forgiveness. I remember vividly one day when I was in the ICU finishing up my charting, and a woman came by. I forgot what her role was, but there was a pen on the counter, and it was about 6 feet away from me. No one had claimed this pen. No one was around this pen. It wasn't my pen. I was the only one sitting at the desk. But she looked around frantically, looking to see who owned the pen so that she could ask permission to borrow it for 5 seconds. Finally, she makes eye contact with me and asks me if she can use this pen. And to me, it really just demonstrated that it is such an ingrained, learned behavior that we have pulled in from childhood all the way into adulthood. Because who freaking cares whose stupid pen this is? We're in an intensive care unit. Just use the pen, fill out your form, and then move on with your life. Like, who are you? Why? Why do you need permission? It's not like you're going to take the pen and leave with it. And even if you did, it's a pen. And it's not that I'm berating her. It's just that I want you to notice when you're dipping back into learned childhood behaviors, because it took me a while to break those patterns as well. I mean, we even grew up in a society asking permission to use the restroom when we were in classrooms. I was just completely bewildered when I got to college and they told me, please don't ask to go to the bathroom, just go. What? We don't have to ask permission? It was the first time I felt like a real adult. Anyway, the main lesson is to always ask, but not for permission. Lesson number 3 is to be unapologetically you. But I want you to be aware that traditional femininity is viewed as weakness. And I kind of came to the conclusion that I was going to be unapologetically me because as a woman, you are always going to be hated on. It doesn't matter what you do. Someone is going to find some sort of fault in you. Women in the media are chastised for being too skinny, chastised for being too fat, chastised for being too outspoken, chastised for being too quiet. In the workplace, men are labeled ambitious. Women are labeled aggressive. Men are labeled leaders. Women are labeled bossy. Men get really powerful labels and we get negative ones. And there are even books that suggest women get shorter haircuts in Silicon Valley in order to be taken more seriously because a shorter haircut appears more masculine. So if you look at some of the big female CEOs in Silicon Valley, Sherry McCoy, the CEO of Avon, she has a very short haircut. Marissa Mayer, CEO of Yahoo, also has a short haircut. Meg Whitman, eBay and HP, she has a very short haircut. Now, I'm not saying having a short haircut is complying to masculine standards or anything like that. What I'm saying is that if you don't like short hair, then don't have short hair. I really like my long hair, and so I keep a long hairstyle. But I am very well aware of how I'm perceived. I'm aware that I'm going to be perceived as more feminine, therefore more weak in certain situations. But I love my long hair and I'm going to keep it and be unapologetically me. I will say that I look a lot younger when I have my long hair. And so typically in interviews, I will pull that up into a bun. And it kind of mimics a shorter hairstyle and a more gender neutral, maybe even masculine look. And I just play the game. That's kind of what I have tried out in my career. And I just play the game so I can get the position. And then once I get the position, my bun comes down and all the curls come out and I'm flowy and glowy and I don't really care. Lesson number 4, don't be afraid to self-promote. Modesty goes out the window at this point. When people fail to notice your major accomplishments, it is your responsibility to illuminate them. And I'm not saying this in a way that's blaming you for not getting the raises and the promotions that you deserve, because that is a systemic problem and the system needs to fix itself and we need more allies. But I think there are certain aspects of, again, that childhood learned behavior of not fully taking in those compliments. So for example, I have started replacing, "Oh, it was nothing," with a phrase like, "I appreciate the recognition. I worked hard to get it done." In certain situations when I don't actually know what to say, I will say, "Thank you so much. I received that." It's a little bit unusual wording, but it works really well for me just to be able to take the compliment of all of my hard work. One year, I was in a networking situation with the American College of Chest Physicians annual meeting, and my sponsor was introducing me to a bunch of the leaders at the organization, and he was introducing me as a superstar. He literally used those words, and it was so amazing. It was so humbling, but it was also very much needed. And I received that compliment. I didn't try to correct him in my introductions. I received fully his introduction of me as a superstar, even though he was giving me such a huge compliment. And I knew that I was going to try to push back, but I stopped myself. And there was only one person that whole night who kind of looked at me a little awkward and made a little slight joke about being humble. And when that happened, I continued to perseverate on it in my mind. But I always like to really rely heavily on statistics. It's the scientist in me. I started to analyze, okay, well, I've had 10 introductions so far, and only one person has kind of teased me about being humble. That's a pretty good statistic. 90% of the time, people were flowing in conversation, were excited to meet me, wanted to hear about some of the work that I had been doing with him and how I envisioned my leadership roles within the organization. And only one of them said that. So I was like, you know what? I'll take a 90%. I would go to Vegas with those kind of odds. This is literally the kind of dialogue that goes on in my mind. And I want you guys to know that because I think you probably also have the same type of dialogue going on in your mind. And if this is still too much for you, I've got a couple of tips. You can self-promote in really subtle ways. So one of the other ways that I have self-promoted was by asking a colleague to do it for me. I was in a situation where my director didn't have exact metrics to measure my leadership with because I was co-directing with someone else and some of the ICU data we were still collecting. So in order to showcase how vastly the ICU had improved just with workflow and relationships and the nurses feeling safe that there was an ICU physician around, I asked the nurse manager, hey, would you mind sending my director an email, just giving her some feedback? I never said, hey, brag about me, talk about all of this kind of stuff. I just left it on her to craft that email. And I knew she would write a really strong letter because in our daily communications, she was complimenting me. And she was also getting specific feedback from several of the nurses saying how they loved that I was really approachable and that I was always available and in the ICU whenever they needed something. Don't be afraid to self-promote and have someone else do it for you if you're hesitant. Lesson number 5 is to say it with a smile. This took me a very long time to learn because I am a very straightforward, no-nonsense type of person. And if I'm upset, or if something you say in the workplace is rude, racist, sexist, I'm going to get mad. And when I'm mad, guess what? As a woman, I am more likely to be labeled as aggressive instead of assertive or other positive leader attributes. Accusations of being too pushy or aggressive are designed to keep you quiet. And I am not the type of person that stays quiet. So I've learned that sarcasm mixed with a little bit of shame and throw in a smile can really go a long way. If a male colleague in the workplace says something sexist, I will respond with a, James, look at you labeling women. You're so socially awkward. And then walk away. People, not just men, hate being labeled socially awkward. Therefore, it is my favorite phrase to use. And I hope you can put that phrase in your toolbox as well. Another one of my favorites is when someone says, oh, you're too pretty to be a doctor. I just laugh and say, yeah, I know they started letting women into medical school now. I don't know if you've heard. Then they kind of have like a little shameful face and giggle a little bit, and the energy is dissipated at that point. This type of stuff takes practice. I'm not saying it's easy. It's taken me a long time to unlearn some of my childhood behaviors, unlearn initial reactions of getting very upset and angry to the point where the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth is a big fat F you. But you will get better in time, and I hope some of these phrases are things you can put into your little toolbox. Lesson number 6, you don't need to be perfect. I want you to know you are all experts in your field already. You don't need to be 100% qualified to apply for a particular position. I read a study that said men are more likely to apply for a particular job whether or not they met the qualifications versus women find that if they don't meet at least 80% of the job description, they will not apply. And let's be real, most jobs put out these job positions not requiring a ton of experience because they know they're going to train you on the job. In January of 2018, I got an email from the American College of Chest Physicians that said, become the new section editor for the journal Chest. And I read the description and it sounded like it was right up my alley, but there were several qualifications that I did not meet. But because I knew about the statistics of women applying for these jobs, I knew I had to apply anyways. What was the worst that was going to happen? They were going to say no, and then my ego would be hurt for a little bit and I would move on with my life. But if they said yes, this would be an amazing opportunity for me. And then I found out that my sponsor was also applying for the position. He had a master's in statistics and had completed a fellowship training with the NIH, was a big boss researcher, super fancy. And I thought, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't apply for this. But I thought, you know what? I need to practice. I will at least get valuable feedback, and leadership will know that I'm an ambitious young physician. So I applied, full knowing that the competition was going to blow me out of the water. And guess what happened? My sponsor got the job. Did you think I was going to say I got the job? No, he got the job. He was way more qualified than I was. But check this out. He decided in that role that he needed team members, and they developed positions for me. He created positions that were not in the original job description that I was very well qualified for, and he wanted me on his team. And if I didn't apply, I wouldn't have had that opportunity that was never republicized because they were just going to pick team members from the applicant pool. This is really about imposter syndrome, and that is a beast of a topic, and so I won't be doing a deep dive on it, but just know that you can grab these opportunities without being 100% qualified. Lesson number 7, women aren't always your friends, let alone mentors, and that's okay. So the truth is that backstabbing is actually gender blind, and that's fine. But there's so much implicit bias that goes on in the workplace. And some of it even comes from ourselves. We expect women to treat us better. We expect women to be more nurturing. But I do want to point out that there is something called queen bee phenomenon. And this is used to describe a woman who has flourished in a leadership role, especially in a male-dominated industry, just like medicine, and who uses her position to keep other female worker bees down. So essentially, in order to survive, this queen bee adapts very masculine traits, just like one of the boys, and doesn't help other females in the workplace. I mean, this type of queen bee might as well just be another man in a leadership position who's completely clueless about gender bias discrimination in the workplace. This becomes extremely confusing to navigate in the workplace because essentially this queen bee uses the fact that she is a woman to quote unquote say that she understands you. I don't necessarily have strategies around this, but what I do want you to know is that you're not alone if you feel like you have a female boss who is not advocating for you, or you have a female boss that you feel is just as sexist towards you. That is called queen bee phenomena, and it's something that you should know about. Lesson number 8. Confidence is key. I learned this very early on in my medical career as a medical student, and it really boils down to fake it till you make it. It's something I have been using since I was a third-year med student very successfully because people notice when you impress them. What they don't notice is when you fall in line with the average knowledge base of every other medical student or every other resident. When I was a third-year medical student, my first rotation was OB-GYN. During rounds, my attending asked the entire group, what is the size of an enlarged ovary that causes a risk of torsion? And I didn't really have an idea of what the answer was, but I just simply yelled out 5. I don't know what possessed me to do it in front of this extremely large group of senior residents, other surgeons, all of the attendings. I just yelled out 5. I didn't even give a unit of measure, not 5 centimeters, not 5 inches. I just said 5. And I was actually right. It was 5 centimeters. But because I was so confident when I said it, I was the first one to respond. I was loud and proud. The attending was so impressed with me, so overly impressed with me. And subsequently, throughout rounds, of course, there were other questions that I just didn't answer correctly. But he never noticed ever again because I was that badass student that knew 5 centimeters. Because I noticed the way that this particular attending really noticed me, I took that energy of absolute confidence into my surgery rotation because I knew surgery was going to be rough. Oh my gosh. I had a vascular surgeon as my attending, and he liked to play a game called 100 questions. As you can imagine, 100 questions is literally an attending asking you 100 questions in a row during a surgical case when it's quiet. Because he was a vascular surgeon, we were in extremely long OR cases, and he would just ask 100 questions. Some of you guys are probably having a little meltdown that I even survived something like that. But sure enough, he asked me question after question after question. And I gave him my initial thoughts, and I said it with such confidence. Questions 1 through 10, it was just bam, bam, bam. And he would ask me these questions. And by the end of question 10, he just started laughing because I had gotten all 10 questions wrong. And he said, you know what, Rosie, I like your confidence. And that left an impression on him. So I learned very early on that if you don't have medical knowledge, but you have confidence and ambition, people will notice. Attendings will notice. And that is one of the biggest lessons that I have learned, and I continue to use this in my career. Lesson number 9 is learn to say no. And I touched on this a little bit in the episode on contract negotiations, but I don't work for free. And that's when I started to set my boundaries and say no. Your time is extremely valuable. So you can use phrases like, I would love to help, but can't right now. And one thing is I would highly advise you to keep your answers extremely, extremely succinct. There is no explanation needed followed by your no. No, No, thank you. I'm unable to cover that night shift. Period. Because of the internalized guilt that women feel, sometimes a blabbering explanation follows that no. And it's just too much information. Early on, I noticed that I felt very uncomfortable saying no because of that internalized guilt. And so every time I would say no, I would follow it up with this giant explanation. Why I couldn't do it or why I wasn't able to cover that shift. And it was completely unnecessary. And another thing I learned is that you don't always have to be honest. You don't have to be completely transparent. They don't need to know about all of your cards. I have a lot of conversations with young women who are pre-med students in my DMs on Instagram. And many of them will ask me certain questions about medical school interviews. And they'll say, I'm very politically involved and I'm anti-racist. And this is why I want to be a doctor. And I want to make sure that I'm inclusive and smashing patriarchy in the healthcare system. And I'm like, whoa. Just answer their questions when they ask you about your mission, what you're passionate about, and answer it in a way that's just about the mission of increasing diversity in healthcare and for your patients. You don't need to go on an absolute tirade and really show how absolutely angry you are about the current state of affairs, because what you're feeling is 100% valid, but they don't need to know all of you. They just need to know that you're going to be a great med student. And same thing applies with job applications. Recruiters will often ask physicians about their child's life, and sneakily they'll say, we're only asking so that we can help you get into certain school systems and things like that. But really, it's none of their business. I don't tell recruiters too many personal details about me. They just need to know I'm an ICU doctor looking for work. This is my pay rate. These are the locations that I would love to work at. I'm open to working these type of shifts, the end. And if they come back to you and ask you, why? Because that's the dreaded fear, right? Why? Then go ahead and use this phrase. It's personal. Once you drop that phrase, no one can ask you anything. I will confidently go ahead and use this phrase. It's personal and it works very, very well. Lesson number 10, take up space. Take up space. Don't apologize for it. When there is a large meeting, you have a leadership role, take a seat at the table. Stop getting up to allow other people in this supposed hierarchy sit down. I see this during grand rounds all the time in hospitals, and female students will get up to allow someone else to sit down. You got there first, sit down. You're fine. Take up space and don't apologize for it. Don't move. And you're not being rude by demanding space. That's the thing, is that we have these internal conversations with ourselves that we find it to be very rude, but men do it all the time unapologetically. If you're ever in New York and you're able to be on the subway, look at how widely men spread out their legs and women will just shrink themselves to be able to fit in between these seats. Men are so unapologetic about this. And I want you to use that same type of energy in your work, literally and figuratively. Just take up that space. All right, let's go ahead and summarize my top 10 lessons. So lesson number 1, always ask. Lesson number 2, always ask, but not for permission. Number 3, be unapologetically you. Number 4, don't be afraid to self-promote. Number 5, say it with a smile. 6, you don't need to be perfect. 7, women aren't always your friends, let alone mentors, and that's okay. 8, confidence is key. 9, learn to say no. And 10, take up space. I hope you guys have really learned a lot from my top 10 lessons. It's been a blast kind of reflecting on how far I've come over the last 13 years from a med student now to an ICU attending. And I really hope that some of my stories have empowered you to be able to do the same in your workplace. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes to The Female Doc Show and tell all your friends about it.